All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see your faces.
Morning. Morning.
I appreciate your patience as we are entering into what is somewhat uncharted territory for me, because although I have been doing plenty of meetings via Zoom for the last 6 months, this is going to be the first virtual training session that I've ever led. So I appreciate your patience as we embark on this experience together. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm using a different headset today. Everything's
Yes.
excellent.
That sounds
Okay.
fine. Yep.
If at any point I'm trailing off, just let me know and I'll speak up. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to mute everybody, just because as we may know from our own experience, when you get crosstalk in Zoom, it can be difficult to hear what someone's saying. So I'm going to mute everyone. There will be portions of this presentation in which I ask you a question and invite you to participate. So just remember that if you want to speak up, you need to unmute yourself, okay? And I'll do my best to remind you to do that as we go through. All right, so let me go ahead and mute you all. Okay. Great. And now I'm going to share my screen. All right, and here we are. So today's session is meant to be an introduction to interpretation at Mystic Seaport and a general introduction to the institutional history of Mystic Seaport. And in the next 90 minutes to 2 hours, we're going to focus on several things. I'm going to walk you through the museum's institutional history, not all of it by any means, just what's really relevant to the work that you're doing, our mission and our core values and how interpretation fits into that story. I'm going to talk to you about the history of interpretation as a discipline, because I think that's an important and interesting story to learn. And then we're going to talk about some key learning theory that has developed over the last 75 years that drives this discipline. It is a discipline. And talk about some of the fundamentals of what you can do to be an effective docent interpreter at Mystic Seaport Museum. Now, I think you all understand this intuitively, but I think it's just important for me to reinforce that you know, all of the training that we do with you this week will, I hope, serve as a helpful foundation for you. But I think what you're really going to find is that this is just the first step of many that you're going to take. And being a docent is something that you strive to get better at every day. And one of the real joys of doing this work is that every day you're going to learn something new, and you're going to be thinking about how you can leverage that new knowledge you've gained to enrich the experience of the visitors you encounter. So just bear in mind that this is the first step of many that you're going to take on this journey of learning. So with all that being said, I'll just briefly introduce myself to you all. I've met you all individually, but my name is Eric Ingmanson. I am Mystic Seaport Museum's Director of Interpretation. I have worked here since the since March of 2013, and I've been director of this department since October of 2016. And our department is tasked with bringing the museum to life for our visiting public and helping people feel a personalized connection to it. And one of my favorite things to do is to train new folks on the craft of interpretation, and I'm really excited to be spending some time with you talking about that this morning. So let's look at our mission statement. Mystic Seaport Museum's mission is that we strive to inspire an enduring connection to the American maritime experience. there are some key words in this statement and phrases that I want to just highlight for you, and we'll come back to these over the course of the next couple hours. Inspire is a word that's very important to me here, and that is very fundamental to interpretation, I think. The physical process of inspiration is the act of breathing in. And so I like to think that part of our mission here is to breathe life into the past, to breathe life into the American maritime experience, and in so doing, to breathe life into our visitors. Another important phrase here is enduring connection. Now, oftentimes when we interact with visitors here, we think of those interactions as these little finite moments in time. But something that's important to remember is that your goal is to really prompt someone to be curious and to want to learn more about this place and the history we talk about after their interaction with you. So you're here to help light a spark in a person's mind and imagination. We have our vision statement as well. And in our vision statement, we say Mystic Seaport Museum will reimagine the interchange between maritime heritage and broader contemporary culture. Keyword here, heritage. Heritage is something that's handed down from the past as a tradition. Our goal then is to show how the past relates to and is relevant to the world we live in now. And that is a theme that I'm going to hammer away at with you again and again today, is the idea of the importance of relevance and how interpretation really makes that happen. We have our core values, which guide our work every day. First core value is knowledge. Knowledge is a word that's often used, but all these words are things that we often use, but sometimes we don't really pause to think about what they mean. Knowledge is acquaintance with facts, truths, and principles derived from experience. This is a place, Mystic Seaport Museum, where knowledge is shared with the public, but it's also a place where we continue to gain new knowledge through our own continued research and scholarship. Authenticity is a very important core value. When something has the quality of being authentic, it is not false or copied, it is real. And the public perceives museums as being extremely trustworthy places. And authenticity is a key part of that perception. And we have a responsibility to uphold that public trust. Inspiration, I talked about that before. The idea that we breathe life into the past and breathe life into our public. Stewardship. Stewardship is the idea of the protection of something that is worth caring for. When an artifact is entrusted to us, we have a high level of responsibility for its care. And through interpretation, we can inspire other people to feel a similar level of responsibility and to maybe want to support the museum in some way, be it through a membership, a donation, combination of the two, or some other means. Also, we are stewards of our visitors when they are here. They are worthy of our care, and we owe it to them to do our very best every day. And finally, the last core value is community. It's important to recognize that the museum is a social space. We are a gathering place. We're a place where people come together to listen, to share, and to connect. And our visitors are not just these empty vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge from us, not at all. They have their own experiences, values, beliefs, assumptions, and needs, and it's our responsibility to respect those things and use them as a means of making a connection with them. Something that's important to remember here at the museum is that while the village itself is essentially a recreation, what we do here is we tell a place-based story. This is a place that has a long and rich history connected to shipbuilding and maritime history in general. The Charles Mallory and Sons shipyard was active from 1851 to 1875. They built 52 vessels at that time. They were located near the southern part of our property, not too far from where the Henry B. DuPont Preservation Shipyard now stands. Charles Mallory was born in Waterford, Connecticut back in 1796. He apprenticed as a sailmaker in New London and came to Mystic in 1816, supposedly with $1.25 in his pocket. He was able to make it work, and in 1851, he had enough money to take over the lease of this property that I'm describing to you, and he became a very successful shipbuilder, and the rest, as they say, is history. You've got the Greenman brothers as well. George Greenman and Company shipyard was active from 1837 to 1878. They built 97 vessels while they were in operation. George Thomas and Clark Greenman were brothers who grew up together over in Westerly, Rhode Island, and their father was a shipwright. You could say that shipbuilding really was in their blood. They bought this property here in Mystic, which was formerly called Adams Point, and worked together, running different aspects of the business, and were extremely successful. They built the 3 homes that still stand on the avenue that bears their name today. Just another picture of some of the vessels from the yard. Something that's really neat that happened as a result of the Greenman brothers' success is that this little town kind of popped up around their shipbuilding operation, and it was known as Greenmanville. And that's why we refer to the road outside our offices here as Greenmanville Avenue. So again, this is a place-based story, right? A lot of maritime history happened right here, where we are. So how did we come to be? Well, in this photograph, we have the 3 founders of what would become Mystic Seaport Museum. From left to right, you have Carl C. Cutler, Edward Bradley, and Dr. Charles Stillman. Cutler was a lawyer by training from a seafaring family. Mr. Bradley was a silk manufacturer who'd made a sea voyage to China in his teens. And Dr. Stillman was a grandson of Clark Greenman, so he had a real personal connection to this area. What I think is remarkable to note is that the 3 of them founded this museum on December 25th, 1929, which was 2 months after the stock market had crashed. And not exactly the most amazing time to start a nonprofit organization, but they felt there was a need. And they came together out of a desire to preserve and collect artifacts of significance to maritime history. There's a story that is often told, which may be apocryphal, may be true, I don't know, that people were taking wooden half-hull models, which people use in designing boats and ships. People were taking half-hull models and just throwing them into their fireplaces and wood stoves for firewood. And this caused great alarm among our 3 founders, and they felt a need to try to set things right. So in 1929, they created this little organization called the Marine Historical Association. This isn't something that you have to commit to memory, but it's just an important part of our story. The first vessel that Mystic Seaport acquired was Annie, which is a sloop, a sandbagger sloop, and we acquired her back in 1931, and we still have her. So what was going on in the museum profession back in 1929 when Mr. Cutler, Mr. Bradley, and Mr. Stillman started their little organization? Well, museums did exist, but they were very different from what you might think of as a museum today. First of all, they really placed an emphasis on collecting and displaying as much stuff as possible. And they were referred to oftentimes as cabinets of curiosities. This is one artist's rendering of a cabinet of curiosities. I have a few more examples. This is a photograph from a place in San Francisco, California called the Cobweb Palace, which was owned by the gentleman featured here in the photograph named Abe Warner. As you can see behind him, he was an avid collector of many things, including scrimshaw, engraved sperm whale teeth, and walrus tusks. And Abe, he just displayed as much as he could at his business. And he was somewhat eccentric because the ceiling of his business was covered in cobwebs, and he was very adamant about not disturbing the spiders or the cobwebs whatsoever. So they just kind of did their own thing and formed these amazing formations of cobwebs on the ceiling of his little cabinet of curiosities, and was known as the Cobweb Palace. And this, my friends, is a photograph of the earliest museum exhibit at Mystic Seaport Museum. It was in the Wendell building, where we eventually will be putting our figureheads display back up. And as you can see from this photograph and the one that follows, there's a real emphasis on displaying as much, in terms of artifacts, as much stuff as we can. And it's not really arranged to tell a specific story per se. It's really meant to just put the artifacts on display for people to observe and regard. And this was common practice in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s when Mystic Seaport Museum started. But by the time our museum was founded, there was this growing conversation in the academic history community and in the museum community that said, okay, well, great, we're really good at collecting stuff, but how do we make John and Susie Q public care about it? What about people? How do they figure into this? How do we make people interested in history and the past? One of the earliest known instances of the use of the word interpret in the manner that I'm using it with you now comes from John Muir, who was a leading environmentalist and the founder of the Sierra Club. And he said the following. He said, as long as I live, I'll hear waterfalls and birds and winds sing. I'll interpret the rocks, learn the language of the flood, storm, and the avalanche. I'll acquaint myself with the glaciers and wild gardens and get as near to the heart of the world as I can. That's from his journal circa 1871. So I'm going to pause for a moment and invite you to kind of look at that quote. And I want to ask you, what do you think he means by using the word interpret in this statement? And if you feel so compelled, unmute yourself and share your impression with the group.
And one aspect I see there is maybe how all these different components interact with each other. So not just standing there, but they have connection, each piece to the other pieces.
That's a good point. That's a good point, Stephen. So he's trying to see how they all fit together to kind of come up with some sense of wholeness. What's the big picture, right? Good point. Other impressions?
I look at it as translating from one experience to another, or one language to another, and to show the commonality between the two, so there's an understanding.
Excellent. Very good. Any other impressions that people would like to share? I think those two thoughts are great. What we're really getting at here is, again, he's looking at his relationship with these different natural phenomena he's describing, and how can he articulate that relationship to someone else to help them feel the same level of passion that he does. And that's really what interpretation's about. bridging the gap between the visitor and the collection, the objects, the exhibits. Now, when we think about the public, sometimes we encounter or may observe what I refer to as the jaywalking problem, where seemingly people don't seem to understand or recognize aspects of history that we think are perfectly obvious. And, you know, Jay Leno used to do this segment on The Tonight Show when he hosted it called Jaywalking, where he'd go out on the street and he'd put people on camera and he'd ask them something like, when was the War of 1812? Or who is buried in Grant's tomb? And sometimes people would be stumped. And you'd sit there kind of scratching your head saying, what's going on here? As another example of that, this is just from Forbes magazine just a couple years ago. If you'll indulge me, I will read the slide to you just because I find it striking. A survey released earlier this month revealed that only 1 in 3 Americans would pass the United States citizenship test, a bar easily met by the vast majority of the immigrants who take it. Among the embarrassments, 2% of those identified climate change as the cause of the Cold War. There were 13 original states, name 3. Only 28% of respondents could. What is one thing Ben Franklin is famous for? Only 24% answered correctly. 37% suggested he invented the light bulb. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? 12% said the Civil War. 6% said Vietnam. Now, what I would submit to you is that oftentimes when this comes up, people frame it as sort of this indication of a societal decline. If you read articles about this stuff, that's how it's often portrayed. But what I would tell you is that if you dig into this a little bit and you go further back in history, every generation has this same kind of lament or observation, that they just can't believe that more people don't understand things that they regard as axiomatic. And I think it's important to kind of think about why that is. Why does that happen? Why is it that so many of us are quick to forget some facet of history that we may have learned in school once upon a time? Why do we retain some information and forget so much else? Well, I'd say it's just part of being human. And teaching history is something that we've struggled with in museums and in classrooms for a long time. And a key part of this is this notion of history versus the past. Back in the early 90s, there were 2 folks, Roy Rosenzweig and David Thielen, who were history and social science professors, and they did this telephone survey where they contacted a bunch of people, a random sample, and asked them various questions about knowledge of history and their interest in it. And they came away with some interesting conclusions. One is that in the minds of the broader public, the word history itself often has negative connotations, and it calls to mind the forced regurgitation of facts, tedious memorization. And, you know, we have this cliche that we often use in American English. We say, well, that's history. It means something's dead and irrelevant. It's done with. It's completely useless. Whereas the phrase the past brings to mind things like family history, genealogy, consider the growth of services like Ancestry.com, books, movies, both documentary and dramatic. Filmmakers like Ken Burns have done and continue to do very well, making films about the past. The past also conjures up the image of keeping a journal or a diary, collecting things, visiting museums and historic sites, etc. The key differences here are these. Passivity versus activity. Passive learning is bad. It does not drive retention or passion or interest in something. Personal connection is also very important. If we find that something we're learning is personally significant to us, we're more likely to retain it. If we don't, then we just as soon forget it. It's just the way our brains are wired. And free choice learning versus compulsory work is very important. When we learn something of our own free will, we're more apt to learn it. And when we're compelled to learn something, it's less apt to stick. Not always, but less often. Now, prior to the late 1920s, early 1930s, when Mystic Seaport started, academia's approach to history was a little bit different from what we do today. It placed a real intense emphasis on documents and only documents as a source material to help historians get at what you might call the forensic truth, facts that you could find on the written page. And there was this broader belief in the profession that it was a historian's job to stick only to the facts and to meticulously piece together what actually happened. And a question that I'd like to pose to you is, are there any problems that you think such an approach presents? So meditate on that for a second and unmute yourself and share your thoughts.
Well, history is written by the winners, so you are, if you're only researching what is written, you don't know who it was, what their real intent was, or what their motives were, or their biases.
Sure. That's a really good point. Yeah, we're all human beings. Every human being has biases of their own, and those biases can emerge in the source material itself. Absolutely. Other thoughts?
I guess you can't be sure if what's written down is firsthand, secondhand, or rumor.
Absolutely. There, in literary analysis, there's a term, the unreliable narrator. And that could be true in written source material too. You can't always be certain that people are describing things as they actually were. Sometimes they're trying to leave an impression that they want you to have. Absolutely. What else?
Well, I think you could lose a lot of nuance in that, right? Like if there's a lot of real life that just isn't quite written down, right? It's something that you'd have to find through other sources.
Absolutely. Yes. Written sources are very good for certain aspects of the story, but you don't necessarily always get the essence of emotions, social interactions, things like that don't always present themselves on the written page. Other thoughts?
I think you also have to consider what else is going on in the world in a different discipline than what you're actually researching, so you understand maybe the influences there.
Absolutely. Also. Yeah, your sources can be siloed. They can be isolated from other intellectual currents. Yep. These are all very, very good and helpful thoughts. I think I would just, one thing I'd expand on too is that not everybody in the past leaves written source material behind. And it wasn't too long ago that a sizable percentage of people in the world could not read or write. And so their life and their story was left behind in different ways, be it artifacts, the clothing they wore, other things that they left behind. And so it's important to remember that there are limitations to what documents can do for you. We'll come back to that idea a little bit more in a maritime context in a couple of minutes. So 1932, again, around the same time that Mystic Seaport's getting going, there's this gentleman named Carl Lotus Becker, who was a professor of history at Cornell University. And he gave the keynote address at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association in 1932. And American Historical Association still exists. For those of you who don't know about it, it's the leading academic network for American historians around. So when you have the opportunity to be the keynote speaker for the annual meeting of the AHA, it has been and always is a big deal. And he gave a speech titled "Every Man His Own Historian," and it really was, and I don't use this expression lightly, a watershed moment in the history profession that would guide the study of history, both academically and in the museum community, in a different philosophical direction. It's a fairly long and somewhat occasionally esoteric piece of writing, so I'm just going to give you some of what I think are the most important salient points. Something that he emphasized in this speech is that a person is more likely to care about something from the past if it can be related to a present or future concern. This is how the human mind naturally works. So he's really pushing back at the idea of the past simply for the past's sake. People don't have an interest in something from history unless it somehow speaks to something that they care about now. And he gets at this point in the following quote where he says, "I suspect that memory of past and anticipation of future events work together, go hand in hand, as it were, in a friendly way. Mr. Everyman cannot do what he needs or desires to do without recalling past events. He cannot recall past events without, in some subtle fashion, relating them to what he needs or desires to do." So I have a really kind of simple, silly example of that to kind of illustrate what he's talking about. Imagine, if you will, that you're at a party and someone tells a joke that you really find amusing. And you say, "Wow, that's a really good one. I'm going to file that away and try to use it sometime." And then maybe a month later, you're at another social gathering, and someone tells a story or says something to you, and you say, "Oh, wait, that joke that I learned a month ago, that would fit in really well here." Okay, now mentally, what has taken place? You're in your present moment, right? And something in you anticipates that if you can recall this earlier experience you've had, you will then have a payoff in your not too distant future. If you can recall this joke that you learned a month ago and tell it, you anticipate that people will laugh and be entertained by you, as long as you get the punchline right. Okay. So what's happening there is your brain is kind of like a pendulum. It's oscillating between the past, present, and future very quickly. And that's, I would submit to you, that's really how our brains are wired. As much as we like to think about the idea of past, present, and future as these separate and discrete categories, in practice, that's really not how it happens. Our minds are wired to gravitate towards knowledge that we've gained if it's relevant to something we got to do here, now, today. And if it's not of immediate use to us, our brain just files it away or deletes it, gets rid of it. So if we want people to care about the stories that we're telling here, they have to speak to present or future concerns. Another point that Becker makes in this speech is that as humans, we view the past through the prism of our own lived experiences, and every generation remembers and relates to the past in a slightly different way. And that's why if you do an exercise that is called historiography, where you look at how different historians wrote about the same event or person or place at different times, you'll find that they tell the story in different ways, and that oftentimes what they gravitate towards and what they're interested in is driven by the world in which they live. I have to the right here this image of this artist's depiction of Christopher Columbus. And I would say to you that I think this is an illustrative example of what I'm talking about. Back earlier in the 20th century, Italian Americans in particular viewed Christopher Columbus as a highly revered figure. And part of the reason for that, we now understand, is that Italian Americans themselves were a group of people who were looked down upon by a sizable portion of the society in which they were trying to live and work. And by celebrating the figure of Christopher Columbus and bringing him to prominence, it was their way of asserting a certain claim to America's story. Now, what's interesting to note is that in the years since then, our memory of and perception of Columbus has changed significantly because times have changed. So I use that for you as just one example of many of how I think, you know, we view the past through the prism of our own lived experiences. And as our perspective shifts, our perception of what we are looking at changes also. It's not static, it's dynamic. The last important point that Becker makes here is that the act of interpreting history involves striking an appropriate balance of what he calls truth and fancy to generate an imaginative reconstruction of vanished events. And he spends a lot of time in this speech talking about how painters, poets, and musicians have engaged with the past in a very different way for centuries. And I have two images here that I wanted to just meditate on for a minute. The image at the left dates to 1837. It's titled "The Bard Before the Royal Family." And as you may know, in Celtic culture, bards were professional storytellers. And they used a combination of poetry and music to bring the past to life. They were employed by royal courts typically. And they did this, though, with a very specific agenda in mind. Their job was to entertain the royal court in such a way that they would feel good about their past and feel better about themselves. Bards were people who used the past for boosting morale. So they weren't necessarily always the most reliable, dispassionate narrators of past events. They had a motivation and a bias in mind. Oh, excuse me. Just one second here. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to stop and restart sharing. Hold on. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, folks, I am having a slight problem here, but I want you all to stay on the call, and I'm just going to briefly sign out, and I'm going to hop back in, okay? So don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Okay. All right, here we go. Thank you for your patience. Sorry about that. So bards weren't always necessarily the most reliable narrators, but they told the story of the past to help their audience fill a present day concern. And now I have one image on the right here of a fairly iconic piece of maritime art called The Raft of the Medusa, which recounts the wreck of a French naval frigate that ran aground in 1816. Supposedly, 147 people were set adrift on this hastily constructed raft, of which only 15 people survived after being adrift for 13 days. The painting is, of course, an extremely dramatic scene, as you can see here. There's a lot of human emotion, raw emotion, pain, suffering that's imbued into this story. And so the point here, guys, is that something that as interpreters and historians that we can learn from other media, be it art, music, and poetry, is that a great way to draw people into a story is to try to read human emotion and life back into the past. And as interpreters, our job is to be both factually rigorous, be a stickler for accuracy and detail, but to also see humanity in earlier events, because that's how people are drawn into it. Let me give you an example here on the next slide, if I can advance. Do you want to advance? Bear with me again, I'm having trouble. Okay. Let's try again. All right. So, let me give you an example here. If I were to take a dry, factual approach to interpreting this image for you, I might say, this is a sailing ship in heavy seas. The men are attempting to furl the sail, which means roll it up. The sail's hanging from a wooden yard, which you can see here, and they're standing on something that's called a foot rope, right? Now, everything that I've said to you is true, right? It's not wrong. It's not particularly compelling, though, is it? I'm not telling you a story, right? So instead, what if I presented it to you this way? Here we have an image of a ship sailing in heavy seas, and you see this team of 4 men out here on what's called a yard. They're attempting to furl a sail. Now, a few things stand out in this image. One is that they're in a rolling sea, so the ship is rolling back and forth. They're not in a stable position. The second thing that I would point out to you is, imagine, if you will, this sail is likely very heavy, and they're having to use a lot of upper body strength as a team to lift it up. Imagine how hard that must have been to do. And then the last thing I want to point out to you is that they are standing on this little foot rope here, and that's it. They're not clipped into anything. They're not strapped onto anything. They are balancing on this foot rope out on a yard in a rolling sea. Imagine the amount of adrenaline that would be coursing through your body when you're doing this. And you have to be focused on what you're doing, or you could be lost forever. You don't have time to be scared in a situation like this. You have to focus on what you're doing and work with your fellow sailors so that you can get the job done. Now, I just ad-libbed that for you, but the point is that what I just told you instead is, I told you what you might call a human interest story, right? I described what was happening for you, but I also used emotions, feelings, ideas that I would think are somewhat relatable for you. And that's kind of the point here that I'm trying to get at. Now, another intellectual current that's happening at the same time here, again, in the 1930s, is we start to see the emergence of what we call material culture studies. We have these two different disciplines that are starting to kind of come together. We have archaeology, study of human history through a collection and analysis of artifacts and other physical remains, and anthropology, which we know as the study of human behavior in different cultures, past and present. And when we study artifacts, their uses and meanings that have been associated with them, we can begin to understand the lives of people who typically do not appear in traditional documentary sources. So I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I just want to use this maritime example to kind of drive this point home and prompt you to think about it actively for a second. If you were to study a log from a whaling voyage, what do you think you might learn and what might you miss? Someone jump in and share your thoughts.
You'd learn how many whales they caught, where they caught them, what the weather was.
Absolutely. Yep.
You might learn about some people that were on board with the other sailors and how their interactions were with them.
Yep. Yep.
You might miss some of the emotional attributes that the writer might have, because often these things are written in a very laconic, sort of factual way, and one might be interested in how they actually felt at various points during a voyage.
Absolutely.
I think it'd be important to have both the captain or an officer's log and a seaman's log in two totally different perspectives on any event.
Absolutely, because the captain he's keeping a record for a specific purpose from a specific perspective, right? What other thoughts? What might you learn? What might you miss?
You probably don't know how the presidential election is going.
You probably don't. Yep.
So no broader context.
Exactly. You're absolutely right, Bob. It's a myopic lens, right? All very good points, guys. A written source material doesn't necessarily always get to a broader context, and it also is a very narrow perspective into one person's perspective on what's important. You know, you're not going to get a sense of necessarily of what the crew's morale was like here. You're not going to get a sense of what they were doing at dog watch to entertain themselves. Maybe there was a really good fiddler on board. You might never know that from reading a logbook. So something that's important to recognize is that when we're trying to understand an earlier period, we have to go at it from a lot of different directions, looking at artifacts, looking at music, looking at art, looking at poetry, to really try to get to the essence of it. That's one of the joys of being an interpreter, is that it's all fair game to you. Now, I just want to pause for a second and point out to you something that I think is really kind of neat, which is that when all of this stuff that I'm describing to you intellectually is happening, it's not coincidental, I don't think, that you start to see the emergence of these leading living history organizations. You have Colonial Williamsburg, which gets started in 1926. You have the Marine Historical Association, which becomes Mystic Seaport, which starts in 1929. A few years after that, you get Old Sturbridge Village, which was originally the Wells Historical Museum in 1935 and then was renamed Old Sturbridge Village in 46. And you get Plymouth Patuxent, originally Plymouth Plantation, in 47. So, you know, the 1930s and 1940s are some really exciting decades in terms of the growth of museums and changes in the study of history as a discipline. And the stories of these four institutions all kind of follow a similar arc. They start with a small group of people who have some discretionary income that they can spend to acquire and preserve stuff. And they acquire and preserve a bunch of stuff, and then people start coming together trying to make sense of it and tell stories from it. And that's how it all kind of gets going. So I think it's really cool to step back for a moment and look at how we were, as a museum, we were kind of caught up in this broader current that was shaping our profession in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Now, another figure I want to introduce you to, who figures prominently in Mystic Seaport's story, is Marion Dickerman. She was the principal of a private school in New York for girls called the Todhunter School. She was a close friend and associate of Eleanor Roosevelt, and they both taught at Todhunter together. And she worked with Eleanor to also create this organization called Valkill Industries in New York. It was a nonprofit that allowed farmers to make additional money by producing handmade furniture, pewter, and cloth using traditional methods. And this is really, she's a really important figure to look at, and she's someone who you can often miss. But she was doing a few really interesting things. One is that she was really, as you see from this quote here, really interested in hands-on learning, primarily for kids because that was what she was trained in. But she was also interested in finding a way through Valkill Industries to use history to fulfill a present day need. So there was this growing demand in the 1920s and 30s for old-fashioned style furniture and other such things. It was part of what's called the colonial revival. And she recognized that, and she said, well, I can leverage these traditional methods to help farmers who are struggling in upstate New York to put a little more money in their pockets. So that's a great example of how history is used to satisfy a present day concern. And this quote from her, from when she was the director of education here at Mystic Seaport, I think is really special. She says, every school child needs a live museum, for you cannot learn anything without experiencing it. Words, of course, are an experience, but unless they are backed by real, substantial, concrete happenings, they are not very enlightening. A child likes to see, handle, and feel the things about which he has learned. And what I would submit to you is that although she's talking about kids, it's the same for adults. All right. The more we are engaged, the more our senses are activated, the more real an experience is, the more compelling it is. Now, jump forward to 1957. We come to a gentleman named Freeman Tilden. Who is Freeman Tilden? Well, he is often regarded as one of the most influential figures in the development of interpretation as a discipline. He was a writer and a journalist as a younger man. And at the age of 58, when most people would be kind of starting to think about winding down their career, he decided that he wanted to make a career shift. And he was friends with a gentleman named Newton Drury, who was director of the National Park Service. And Newton Drury came to him with a proposition that I personally would regard as a dream job. He said, Freeman, he said, we've got rangers in all of our national parks doing programs for visitors and tours, and the quality of their presentations is all over the place. Some people are doing a really good job. Other people's programs make me want to gouge my eyeballs out. And I don't know how to make the quality consistent across the whole national park system. Can I hire you as a consultant to help me devise a way to train rangers to give consistently good programs at every national park? And Freeman Tilden said, sure, well, that sounds interesting. How would you like me to proceed? And Drury said, I'm sending you out on the road. You're going to go on a road trip for 2 years, go to every national park that you can, go to as many ranger programs as you can, write down your thoughts, and then see if you can come up with a training manual based on that. So he went on tour. And after taking in hundreds and hundreds of ranger programs across the country, he wrote this book called Interpreting Our Heritage. It's still in print. The National Park Service still uses it for training today. And he outlined the 6 principles of interpretation. which I will now take you through. And I've been alluding to these in earlier slides, but we'll just reinforce them now. Some of them will be familiar, some of these ideas are new. The first principle, any interpretation that does not somehow relate what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or experience of the visitor will be sterile. Again, if a visitor doesn't relate to it, they won't care about it. Number two, information as such is not interpretation. Interpretation is revelation based on information. Now, what does that mean? Well, think of revelation as an aha moment, if you will, an epiphany. It's not enough to simply present the facts. You have to present them in a way that sparks people's imagination and prompts their curiosity, okay? Number three, interpretation is an art which combines many arts, whether the materials presented are scientific, historical, or architectural. Any art is in some degree teachable. You're not here to recite an inventory, much as the bards of earlier times were, or artists and poets and novelists do. You're here to tell a story, a rigorous and fact-based story, but nonetheless a story. Number four, if you remember nothing else, remember this. The chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. It's not meant to be exhaustive. You're not here to convey every single bit of content to somebody. Your real goal is to light a spark, to make people curious, to want to learn more after they interact with you. Some learning conversations will last a matter of seconds. Others can last 15 minutes or even longer, but you're there to light a spark. Number five, interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part and must address itself to the whole man rather than any one phase. You need a broad general theme or big idea that holds the information that you offer together. Facts that aren't brought together with a theme become a jumbled collection of minutia. But when you have an overarching framework, a theme that you can reinforce, now you have a story. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And number six, which we will delve deeper into with Liz's training later on this week. Interpretation addressed to children should not be a dilution of the presentation to adults, but should follow a fundamentally different approach, because children are not little adults. I have a 20-month-old little girl at home, and I can assure you she's definitely not a little adult. She sees the world and processes the world in a very different way, and that's true throughout a child's youth as they grow into an adult. And so when we're interpreting to younger audiences, we really have to be intentional about what we're doing and engage them in a different way. We use different tools for them, and we'll talk about that more later this week. Now let's come back to Mystic Seaport. We had a gentleman named Edouard Stackpole here who was the curator of the museum in the 50s and into the 60s. And Edouard was the person who started the interpretation program at the museum. And he referred to them as activists. And he wrote this wonderful little pamphlet that doesn't explicitly cite Tilden's work, but you can see it implicit in Stackpole's writing. And he has a couple of points here about interpreting at Mystic Seaport that I think just bear repeating. Number one, the chief aim of the activist is to stimulate the visitor to a desire to learn more of maritime history. Again, provocation, not instruction. Next one, the activist, employee, or hostess serving as an interpreter will find every visitor as an individual. Again, every visitor comes to this with a unique perspective. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. This is my favorite, number three. The accepted mode of giving a set lecture should be avoided in that this stereotyped form can be boring and dangerous. Nothing subtle there. And lastly, he says, after all is stated, one fact is paramount. The great contribution Mystic Seaport makes to public education is in providing the physical or raw material without which interpretation becomes almost meaningless. It's about the connection between the people and the artifacts, right? We need both in order to be successful. It's not an either or, it's a both and. So with all that being said, in the past 60 minutes, we come to the definition of what interpretation is. It is a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. And by resource, I mean collections, artifacts. That's what it is. So we've established what it is. How do you do it? How do you do a good job? I'm going to try to give you some helpful pointers to translate the what into the how. The best tool that I can give you is a framework that's called the TOR framework, which was devised by an environmental educator named Sam H. Ham, who has done consulting for the National Park Service for a number of years, and he's written many training manuals that I've used. And this framework, I think, is one of the best ways to think about being an effective interpreter. And TOR stands for the following. Effective interpretation is thematic. It is organized. It is relevant. And last but not least, it is enjoyable. Thematic, organized, relevant, enjoyable. Now let's meditate on those different sections. Interpretation is thematic, and themes are not topics. What do I mean by that? Well, the theme is the big picture. It's the thesis of the conversation, and it's one and only one complete idea. It's ideally concise, one or two sentences, interestingly worded using active verbs and personalizing where possible. Why are themes useful? Well, it makes it easier for you to study and retain the content so you can put it to use. It's easier for you to frame a learning conversation around a central point, and it's easier for a visitor to grasp the point you're trying to convey. Now, I want to just point something out to you. The vast majority of the interpretation that you do here as a docent is what's called casual interpretation, right? You're in the exhibit, you're on the ship, the visitors come to you and they have a conversation, right? It's not like you're leading a guided tour with a set outline, okay? But that doesn't mean that themes aren't important. Actually, I would say that in a casual interpretive experience, themes are more important than ever because you have a limited amount of time to talk to someone, and you really got to be thinking about what you want them to walk away from the experience with. And people tend to be good at remembering big ideas. They tend not to remember the more esoteric facts. So it's important that whenever you have a learning conversation, you frame it around a central idea that you can then reinforce through some relevant information. And this is something that you can do throughout your tenure as a docent. I would actually encourage you to just keep a journal and always be thinking about different overarching themes or ideas that you can disseminate through your interpretation. And we're going to take a crack at crafting one. Here's an example of some basic themes. One, ancient Egyptians solved architectural problems in ways people today are still trying to understand. Next one, Gothic architecture wasn't just about pointed buildings and arches, it was about projecting power and inspiring awe in people. Steam engines transformed our lives in 3 important ways. Decisions that we make as humans can have direct implication for the health of pollinators. Our survival as a species depends heavily on the health of pollinators. So take a look at these for a second, and let me just, you can pick one theme statement, and if you feel so compelled, unmute yourself and look at those 2 questions that are in italics at the bottom. What topics are embedded in each of these themes that we can explore? And are they useful in prompting the audience to feel curious? And if so, how? So anybody who wants to jump in, go ahead.
Gothic architecture is interesting to me So I agree. I didn't know about the projecting power, but it makes me want to learn more about it.
Right. So it gives you something that you've heard of before, but kind of presents it, puts a little twist on it, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So that makes your brain go, aha, I want to learn more. Good.
True.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in?
Well, the steam engine one begs the question of what are the three important ways?
Exactly. You got your teaser, right?
The one about pollination, since it references survival, is certainly something that would catch my interest because I would like to survive.
Amen. Wouldn't we all, right? So you guys see what I'm driving at here, right? Like, there is definitely an art to framing even the most casual of learning conversations that you're going to have. And this isn't something that I expect you to like be great at like right off the bat. It's something, it's like any skill. It's something you just keep hammering away at and playing with and testing on your audience until you kind of feel like you find something that sticks. But it's a really great way to approach interpreting. Have a theme that then can be the spark for an interesting dialogue with somebody, and use this approach all the time. Now, theme development takes some work. You know, it's not something that just readily presents itself to you. So I'm gonna have us try a theme development exercise. You may be familiar with this vessel here, which is called Gerda 3. She's tied up near the south entrance over by the LA Dunton. And what I'm going to do with my next slide is I have a few paragraphs of text that talk about this vessel and its story. And what I want to ask each of you to do is to grab a pad of paper and a pencil or a pen, and I'm going to put this information in front of you to kind of digest. And I want you to take a crack at writing a theme sentence that you could use to then lead into the information that you have here. Does that make sense? Do you guys understand what I'm asking you to do? Any questions? Okay. I'm going to advance the slide, and I'm going to start my timer, and I'm not going to rush you on this because it's new information. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to meditate on this, and then we'll come back and we'll share. All right, and that's time. So, let's see if I can advance my slide. Anybody want to give me their 1 to 2 sentence theme statement if you feel so inclined? Go ahead and unmute yourself and let's report out.
Sure.
First try. Ooh, excuse me. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. You go first.
All right. Well, the Gerda 3 is more than a survivor of World War II. The simple little boat was the way of freedom for Jews to get away from Nazis.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent theme statement. I particularly like that phrase of the way of freedom. That has a real, that kind of speaks to the Becker concept of a blend of fact and fancy, right? You're grounding it in evidence, but that phrase has just a kind of a nice dramatic flourish to it as well, which bespeaks the value of the narrative. So good. That's a good start. What else?
Gerda
Oops. Go
is
ahead.
so important in our history. One of heartfelt efforts to save a treasured people.
Very good. Very good. There's human threads there. And we're talking about saving lives. Good stab. Other theme statements.
How were maritime vessels used to move populations from danger?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to talk about this. This boat looks like a lighthouse tender, very simple and small, but what went down below was amazing because it hid 300 people to say and brought them to safety without getting caught.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a good tack too. You say, well, here's this seemingly ordinary looking thing, but something extraordinary happened here. Right?
I might put in form of a question.
Uh-huh.
Imagine what it must have been like to be hiding below and hear the German soldiers' footsteps and voices above you.
Yep, that's a good question. I'm not necessarily sure that would function necessarily as a theme, but that would be an effective thing to segue to from your theme because it's very powerful and very evocative. It instantly creates a sense of fear and apprehension in your audience and empathy, which you certainly want to do. But you might need to, before you take that approach, you might need to frame it a little bit more for them because they may not be familiar with the backstory, right? But there's a lot of good fundamentals in that question, Steve. Absolutely.
So Eric, here's one with a little poetic license, but I'm not sure about it.
Take a crack at it.
Without Gerda 3, hundreds of innocent people could have died during World War II.
I think that's a very solid theme statement because the record, I mean, it's a little bit of there's a little bit of conjecture there. So you might want to qualify that with maybe like it's possible hundreds of people would have died because you can't say for certain that they wouldn't have escaped some other way. But in general, I'd say that's you're on a very good track with that one. Anybody else have a theme that they want to share?
Sure, I'll share mine.
All right.
Don't judge a book by its cover. The same is true for this little boat. Despite its humble appearance, Gerda and her crew assisted in saving the lives of hundreds of Jewish refugees during World War II.
Mm-hmm. A little boat tells a big story, right? Very good. Anybody else have something that they want to share?
Eric, Bob again, you may be touching on this later. So I heard you encourage each of us to have a notebook and develop our own themes.
Yep.
Then do you in turn have an opportunity for interpreters to share themes, since what others come up may be useful as each of us develops our own portfolio, so to speak?
Yes, absolutely. I think, you know, in an informal way, whenever the supervisors and I are out on the grounds interacting with you on a one-on-one basis, that's a great time for you to share what you're working on with us. And the other thing that that I'd like to, I have to play around with the mechanics of it a little bit, is we put a lot of our interpreter training manuals and texts on Google Drive, and I'd love to leverage that platform as a means of peer-to-peer sharing as well. If you have a particular book or source that you've been looking at, or that has prompted you to think about a theme that you think is useful that you'd like to share with the group, I think that would be a great means of doing that. So some of you already have a Google account that I've set up for you. Others, I still need to get to you. But what I'll do is maybe today I'll get your account set up so that you can get on our server, you can access our handbooks, and you can also, I'll make sure that you have appropriate permissions to put stuff into that folder as well for sharing. So that's a good point, Bob. It's important to workshop themes with each other. Absolutely. So, and any other questions before I go on to my next part of the framework here? You get what I'm driving at, right? The idea of, if you give your brain these little thematic anchors, it's going to make the content much easier for you and easier for the public, right? And you can work on these thematic anchors all the time. Let's come to the O part of the TOR framework. Interpretation is organized. Now, if you interpret long enough, or if you've given presentations over the years, we've all experienced some variance of this, I would think. The view of boredom. It's interesting to think about this in an interpretive context in terms of where boredom comes from, what drives it. Organization has a lot to do with it. The more attention the brain pays to a given stimulus, the more elaborately that information will then be encoded and retained into your memory. That is why moments in our lives that prompt really strong feelings of emotion or experience tend to be really seared into our memories very clearly. You know, like for me, I remember very clearly the moment my daughter was born, because that was among the most intense emotional experiences of my adult life, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that every visitor interaction is going to have that level of emotion. It certainly will not. But attention is driven by care, okay? The more you care about something, the more you retain it, the more you pay attention to it. We also have a lot of evidence that suggests that our attention span, even if we are really good at paying attention, it still is a lot of work. If we do the same thing for 10 minutes or more, we start checking out. It's hard not to. And it's important to remember that in a museum setting, attention is voluntary. And if something requires effort in order to pay attention to it, the average museum visitor will choose to ignore it. So we have to make it easy for them. We have to grease the skids, so to speak. And organization figures prominently into that. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Now, imagine, if you will, that you had plans to go see the movie Jaws when it first came out. So you haven't read about the plot, but you've seen a preview for it. And as you're driving to the theater, You got a flat tire, so you were late. You arrive at the theater late, and they refuse to refund your ticket. You walk into the theater, and this is the scene you see. You see this massive shark throwing itself onto the transom of this boat with Roy Scheider and Robert Shaw standing there, cowering in fear. My question to you simply is, from this moment forward, are you going to retain much of the rest of the movie? What would your guess be? Yes or no? You going to retain much or remember much of what happens after this? What do you think? I'd say you probably wouldn't. Now, maybe you think I'm wrong, but I'd say you probably wouldn't. Because your brain will be obsessed with trying to make sense of the relationships between the characters and asking, how did we get to this point? And that's, the brain doesn't like jumping into the middle of things. It likes narrative. It likes a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when it's denied that, distraction happens quickly. And that's true in visitor interactions, guys. If a visitor comes onto the Morgan or into Away with Wood, and you're like 3/4 of the way through a learning conversation with somebody else, it's going to be a little bit of a chore for that next visitor to join in and pick up on what you're talking about. So what's really helpful if you have those instances is to take a moment if somebody else is in your presence and you say, I'm so glad you're here. We're just talking about X. Okay? What you've done in that moment is you've at least clarified for the visitor in broad strokes what you're talking about so that they're not totally lost. Okay? They're no longer jumping in midstream. Now they're a little more with you. Here's another way to look at it. I'm going to do a little exercise with you. I'm going to show you 2 lists of words for a short time. And I want you to see how many of them you can remember. Here's the little pop quiz, David, that we were talking about. So I'm going to show you, the first list is going to appear on the left. It's going to be up for 10 seconds, and then it's going to disappear. All right. So anybody want to unmute yourself and tell me how many of those words you can remember now?
Plant bottle chair mast.
Plant bottle mast.
Okay. We got 3. Anybody else? Anybody got all 6? Heck no, right? Let's try list number 2.
Shirt, tie, jacket, slacks, belt, shoes.
All right,
Shirt.
unmute. Anybody got the list?
Shirt, tie, jacket, pants.
Belt, shoes.
All right, anybody else got them?
Shirt, jacket, tie, belt, pants, and shoes.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to bring the 2 lists up now. Oh, actually, I can't do that. But let me just ask you this, a real Captain Obvious question. What's the difference between these 2 lists?
One was organized and one was all over the place.
Right? One was all over the place.
Well, one's theme was obvious. I don't know what the first theme was, but
There wasn't one. Do you want to know how I generated that list? I literally sat in my chair and spun in a circle and listed 6 things.
you had a mouse.
I got a mouse on my computer. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Ha
Because I have mice.
Right. What else was different about those 2 lists?
The structure.
The structure. Right. Say more about that.
One was linear and you could think about it from head to toe, and the other one was circular and just like spinning around in your chair.
Right, right. So that's a really important point, Barbara. So what I did with that second list is I crafted it in a way that fit into a pre-existing category in your brain already. Everybody in this meeting goes through the process of getting dressed every day, and even if you don't necessarily wear all these things every day, you certainly can relate to the parts of the body that they go on to, and I arranged them physically from top to bottom in terms of how our bodies are built. So organization really matters when you're interpreting, okay? And you have to think about how people what pre-existing filing systems exist in people's brain cells, and how can you fit new information into those pre-existing systems, okay? Narrative, in other words, beginning, middle, and end, structure, themes, clarity. Here's another example of that in practice with interpreting, right? Imagine you have this spiel. Welcome aboard the Charles W. Morgan. This was a whaling ship. That's the helm back there. Captain Tinkham had this special cabin built for his wife because she had trouble with seasickness. That's the try-works where they processed the whale blubber into oil. The captain's quarters were aft and the crew's quarters were forward. All right, guys, what's the problem with this?
Boring.
It sure is.
It's in, you gotta know the link. You have to know too much to follow it.
Exactly, right? It's like I'm throwing all this different jargon at you and just assuming that you get it, right? What else? What else is problematic?
Why do I care?
Why do you care? Exactly. There's no human threads. There's no story. What else?
Isn't it a pirate ship?
We got to address that, right? Yeah. So again, you know, you got to organize the words before they come out of your mouth, right? You got to think it through. That's part of the real craft of interpreting. Okay. Avoiding non sequiturs.
If I can add something to this, that
Yes.
statement lends itself to the question, where's the exit?
Right. Right. You got to
No,
think.
I'm done. Where's the next boat?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Like, you know, there's nothing in here to kind of make you want to stay, right? So again, guys, two points that I would, if nothing else, I would just reinforce this. The brain tends to pay more attention to the gist than peripheral details when learning something new. And the brain doesn't like to multitask. And it's when it's faced with unfamiliar information, just jumping into it is impossible. Pieces of information are always competing for our attention. And when they're linked together in a logical thematic sequence, they're easier to retain. And I think, you know, that it's important to remember that as the interpreter, you're trying to make people curious, you're trying to help them appreciate something, but you're also trying to make sure that their brain doesn't have to work too hard. All right? And that doesn't mean that you're talking down to the visitor. It means that you're working with them. It's the same exact way that a good server in a restaurant or bar takes care of you. Like a good server is someone who makes it easy for you. They can rattle off the list of the specials, no problem. They can tailor their pitch to what you really need, and that's what you're trying to do. Make life easy for the visitor. We come to the R in the TOR framework, relevant. This is a word that is often thrown around in museums and public history, but we don't always necessarily spend enough time meditating on what it means to make history and the past relevant to people and how specifically we can do that, because it's not easy. It takes some effort. But there are some ways to do that. Two tools that you can put in your relevance toolkit are these. When your interpretation is meaningful and personal, it becomes relevant. When I say meaningful, what I mean is we're able to relate a new idea to something already in our brains. And when something is personal, that means that knowledge that sticks is often linked to something that we as human beings care about, right? Which I've touched on at earlier points now. I love this cartoon from the New Yorker. It was actually at my first museum job 14 years ago. Somebody put this up on the fridge in the break room, and it's always stuck with me. Instead of it sucks, you could say it doesn't speak to me. So relevance is about making it speak to you and to the public. So how do you think about this, right? Well, I love Venn diagrams. Here's one way to kind of frame it, you know. It's something that's called the Object Knowledge Framework, which was developed by a museum curator named Ely Wood about 10 years ago. And very simple. She says, you've got the world of the object, okay, and you've got the visitor's knowledge, experiences, or beliefs on the other side, and interpretation is where those two worlds overlap. So in the object world, what do you have there? You have the general facts, data about the exhibit, the ship, wherever it is that you're interpreting. And then on the other side, you have the visitor's knowledge, experience, values, and beliefs. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how the heck, as a complete stranger, can I even come remotely close to ascertaining a person's knowledge, experiences, values, or beliefs? Well, the short answer is it's not easy, and I don't expect you to really get an in-depth understanding of it, but there are some things you can do. Here's a really obvious one. Some of our visitors are more extroverted, and they will have a whole slew of questions to ask you. And those questions, if you listen actively and think about them, are a window into what they're interested in and what they're passionate about. And sometimes if you listen actively to those questions, they can actually give you clues that can help to guide you to other stuff that will pique their interest. Other folks are a little more reserved, and when you are working with those visitors, there's a different approach that you can take. A few different things you can do. Some tactics include using analogies, comparisons, similes, and metaphors. These are really simple things that can start helping people feel connected to what they're looking at. Let me give you an example from the first month of my museum career back in 2006 when I was a seasonal docent at the Nantucket Whaling Museum. I was sitting in a presentation led by a wonderful docent named Garth, and he was talking about the process by which whale blubber was rendered into oil. And if you haven't actually done this yourself, it's kind of hard to visualize. But what Garth did that was really clever was he said, now you may have never processed whale blubber into oil, but you've probably either cooked or seen a piece of bacon cooked in a skillet, right? He said, and what happens to a piece of bacon when you cook it? You expose it to heat, and the fat that's in the bacon is initially solid, but the heat turns it into a liquid. And there's some stuff that's left behind in the pan. He said, rendering blubber is the same way. You expose the blubber to heat, the fat renders into an oil, and then there's some stuff left on the top called crisp or crackling, which they then would skim off and feed into the fire. Now, that was a very simple comparison, but instantly Garth was able to help me understand what processing blubber really was like, and he did that by relating it to something I knew. That's what I'm getting at with relevance here. Self-referencing is another very useful trick to achieving relevance. And that's getting people to think about themselves as they think about new information. So, quick, easy example. You step onto the Charles W. Morgan, right? Something that I often like to do with people is I'll say, take a second and look up. And I'll direct their attention to the two hoops at the top of the foremast. And I'll say, Now imagine if you had to climb all the way up to those hoops and stand up there. How do you think that would feel the first time you did it? Right? Might be kind of nerve-wracking, right? A little scary. But imagine the view that you would have from up there. And imagine having the responsibility of looking out at the open ocean from that spot and trying to see the puff of a whale's breath from its blowhole on the surface of the water. That's what it meant to climb to the hoops on a whaling ship. Okay. Now, what I've done there is used the tool of self-referencing, because I have used my words to prompt a visitor to imagine themselves in this new physical space. Okay. And oftentimes, if you can prompt a visitor to use their imagination and superimpose themselves onto a particular scene or place, that's a very powerful tool, very simple, something that children's literature employs especially well, and something that works equally well with a lot of adults, okay? Another tactic that you can use is what we call universals or universal concepts. Universals are intangible or symbolic connections to ideas that, as far as we know, have always had special significance to humans everywhere and for all time. We also sometimes call these things human threads. I'm not going to read all of these because that would be death by information, but it's not an exhaustive list. It's meant to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about when I say universals. So something as an interpreter that you're often trying to do is you're trying to kind of read these universal concepts, these human threads, into the stories. And that is a way to help people be able to relate to them, okay? So think about those human threads all the time. What makes a story relatable to somebody else, okay? Because, you know, the people who were sailing on the Morgan in 1850, they were human beings too. You know, they had a lot of the same concerns and emotions that we do. We just have to try to tease them out sometimes. So let's play with these universals a little bit. We're just going to do a quick little brain exercise here with several classic maritime paintings. And I want you to just look at each of these paintings and just shout out some kind of human thread or universal that stands out to you. It could just be a one-word answer. So here we have this is one of my favorite paintings called The Gulf Stream by Winslow Homer, 1899. What human threads jump out to you with this artwork?
Fear.
Fear, right? There are sharks circling. What else?
Survival.
Yeah, survival, right? Like, you know, despite the fact that it looks like the odds are stacked against him, that the gentleman on this sailboat is he still looks strong, right? He's holding on. What else?
Hope.
Hope, right?
Right.
There's a sail on the horizon. Maybe he has a chance. What else? Any other human threads that you can see?
Thirst.
First. Say more about that. Or thirst.
Well,
Thirst.
it may be hopeful, but it looks like the mast is broken. He's, you know, he's water everywhere, but none to drink.
Yeah, there you go. I got you. Yeah.
Loneliness.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I don't see anybody else around, right? Let me take you to the next one. This is a classic by James Buttersworth, another painter. We have a lot of his paintings in our collection. So what universals or human threads do you see here?
Serenity.
Right?
Adventure.
Adventure. Yeah, look at the tension in those sails, right? Pushing it. What else?
A crowd of people standing on the edge so they don't all fall over.
Right. I look at that and I think about teamwork,
Mhm.
right? That's a universal. Yep. But also, Eileen, to your point, maybe a little bit of fear or apprehension. Here's another one. This is a classic pen and ink by Clifford Ashley from the illustrated edition of Moby Dick. So what universals do you see here, guys?
I see fear in this one, in danger.
Yeah, there's a slight difference in scale between that whale and the boat, right?
Yeah.
What other universals do you see?
Surprise.
Yeah, surprise for sure.
Mystery.
Mystery. Yeah, what lies beneath. Yeah. So, you know, the point here, guys, is that if you, as you learn new material, as you do an exhibit, look for these human threads in the stories, because oftentimes you can leverage those to make people care about what you're saying and make them more interested. So, and you can find them. Sometimes it takes a little more work to kind of tease them out if the material is somewhat esoteric or a little harder for you to understand. But I promise you, the human threads, the universals, they are there. You just got to look for them. So we come to the last part of the framework. Interpretation is enjoyable. Okay, this is kind of like the well-duh part of my presentation, but sometimes we can lose sight of this. Interpretation needs to be done in a way that matches an audience's idea of having a good time. That doesn't mean that it always has to be funny or lighthearted, but it has to be something that you want to do. Because remember, the act of visiting Mystic Seaport Museum and coming into the exhibit where you are stationed is a voluntary choice. They're not compelled to do it. They do it of their own free will. So it's incumbent on you to make sure that they feel like they made a good decision, okay? So some simple tactics, again, that we can sometimes overlook. Smiling, really important, right? Now, when my facial muscles are at rest, I don't naturally smile. I kind of naturally have a frown, right? And how many of you, if you've been at home, maybe have had your significant other or spouse look at you and say, "What's the matter?" And you say, "I'm fine, nothing's wrong." And they say, "Well, your face says otherwise." Look, honestly, nothing's wrong, right? Be cognizant of the resting position of your face and your body language overall. Um, Active verbs are really important in your language. It's, even though you're talking about the past, it's okay sometimes to use the present tense to describe a situation that might have been happening in the exhibit or on the ship once upon a time. Active verbs imbue a conversation with energy and life. The third one is really, really valuable, is to remember that when you're interpreting, it is a conversation, all right? It's not just about what you are giving to the visitor. It's not all on your shoulders. It's about what the visitor is giving back to you. And you need to value the contributions of others to the conversation. And something that you should be aware of in an interpretive context is the more one-sided the conversation gets, either from you or the guest, the more it's kind of out of balance and the more you have to kind of try to get it back into that little sweet spot. It really should be, at best, a casual give and take. And because the more of dialogue is taking place, the more active you both are being and the more learning is happening. And then another one is let your passion for the subject matter come to the forefront. It's really important to be excited about this stuff. And enthusiasm is contagious, and when people see a passion in you, that's inspiring, it's invigorating, and they like it. Now, when it comes to making interpretation enjoyable, you must Icarus, you must not fly too close to the sun. You can get into trouble. You can run into the world that we call interpropaganda, which is when you ignore multiple points of view, you skew the evidence towards a foregone conclusion, you oversimplify facts, you discourage dialogue, and you don't allow your audience to have or maintain a personal perspective. You must avoid that. And interpretainment is something else that's really important to avoid. I'll tell you a quick personal story. Many years ago, I went on a bus tour of Manhattan with my mother and my sisters and my grandfather before he passed away. And my grandfather had worked in New York City his whole adult life on Madison Avenue in an ad agency. And he hadn't been back to the city for a long time. And we thought it would be fun to go on a bus tour because he had some mobility issues. He just wanted to see the city again. And so we got on this double-decker bus tour, which was billed as a historic tour of the city. And but our tour guide fell into the trap of what you would call interpretainment. And the reason I can say that with conviction is that I don't remember anything that he said, but I do remember his name. His name was Lee Klein, and he was the most self-promoting interpreter I've ever encountered. And I say that because whenever he had the opportunity, he reminded us to look up his Wikipedia page at the end of the program. And he had this kind of this laugh that he slipped in a lot. He laughed at a lot of his own jokes, kind of like that was a little bit much. And at one point, actually, a guy lit up a cigarette on the street, and Lee has a microphone, and he yells into the microphone, says, "You should quit smoking. It's bad for you." And the guy on the street said, "Why don't you F off?" And he held up the middle finger. And that, my friend, is an example of interpretainment. It's when you arrange the content around a punchline, you oversimplify things, and you make the assumption that the audience is not truly interested in the material and that you have to make it all about yourself in order to be interesting and enjoyable. That is wrong. Quite the opposite. You can use your personality and your knowledge to make the material enjoyable for people. But don't go too far down the road of making it all about yourself, because when you do that, you are an interpretator and not an interpreter. Okay. So if nothing else, if you remember nothing else about the 2 hours you've spent with me today, remember that effective interpretation is thematic, organized, relevant, and enjoyable. If you use that framework, it will serve you well today and every day. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That concludes the content that I've put together for you. At this point, we have a little bit of time left. I don't have to have a hard stop at 11:30. So I'm just going to open the Zoom conversation for questions.
Yeah, so I have a question for the group. So I'm pretty new to this. I actually just did my first volunteering assignment yesterday, and one of the things that I was struggling a little bit with was sort of getting people engaged, right? So there would be some people that would kind of come up and ask questions, and I was trying to make myself available. But does anybody have like kind of best practices for sort of starting that dialogue with people without? I don't want it to feel like I'm forcing myself into their trip. You know what I mean?
Sure. So I have one tactic that I would suggest you use. And it comes not from me, it comes from a gentleman who was the lead interpreter for our blacksmith shop here, Bill Shear, for 25 years. he often used the analogy of a trail of crumbs. He said, when I interpret, I'm laying a trail of crumbs, and I'm seeing if people pick one up. And so what I would say to you is, when someone comes into your space, the first and most important thing to do is to make them feel welcome and that you're glad to see them. So like, welcome, glad you're here. And then I would say, think of something that you can say in a sentence that encapsulates why the place where they are is special and unique, perhaps like no other place they've ever seen before. Okay. So as an example, if I happen to be interpreting on the Morgan, I'll say, you are now standing aboard the oldest commercial vessel still afloat. Okay. Now, they may not know exactly what I mean by that, but in one sentence, I've kind of given them a crumb that might pique their curiosity and also conveys why the place that they're in is unique. If you're in Collins Gallery, Away with Wood, you might say, so something that's really neat is that we're doing work, we're doing work here that normally only happens behind the scenes, but right now it's happening right in front of you. Okay. So is there something that you can say that kind of shows how the place is extraordinary, you know? And that is that's a very helpful tool, because what that will then do is, if they take the bait, you know, if they're interested and they want to dive deeper with you, they will. Or they may just say, oh, that's cool, thank you very much, and they keep walking. That's not a failure on your part. Okay. Right. Some people really like to chat and want to dive deep. Other people, they get that little nugget from you and they're good to go. And you don't need to force the issue there. Okay. Does that help you at all?
Yeah, that's very helpful, because I think that helps sort of figure out who wants to have more conversation versus who really wants to see it on their own, which, to your point, both are fine, but you know, I don't want to ignore people either. So that's really helpful.
Yeah.
I have a suggestion actually as well. I think sometimes the best interpretation can happen after visitors have been in the exhibit for a little while. So it's important to circulate, because you can often hear, you know, families will be talking about something and they'll have questions and you can hear them. And you can kind of say, oh, I see you're looking at X, Y, and Z. Did you know? Because if you try to engage people as soon as they walk in, that can be hard, because it may be their first time in there and they don't know what the exhibit is. So, you know, it's important to welcome them, let them know what's going on, but let them wander a little bit first. And you'll be able to see that people are kind of like struggling with something, or maybe want to talk about something. And there are people who are going to not want to talk to you, and you can read that in their body language. And it's always important, I think, not to force it. You know, if somebody is trying to walk away from you as you're talking, you know, just say, thank you for visiting. And there's, you know, people sometimes just like to do it on their own.
Right.
Yeah, interpretation is one of the few disciplines where it's socially acceptable to stalk people.
It is. I mean, I was thinking it sounds like stalking, but you know, then you know, because I hear people walking by and I'll say, I wonder what, and you know the answer. So it's okay to say, oh, I hear you're talking about that. And did you know? So
what I would say is,
your job.
Yeah, it's not stalking so much as it's active listening, right? Yeah. Thank you, Liz. That's a very good point.
So one of the things that works well for me, and I interpret the drugstore when we were interpreting the drugstore, that works very well for me is, as soon as they walk through the door, is to welcome them back 120 years. This is the CVS or Rite Aid of the late 1800s. And that works especially well for children, but I've gotten a lot of ahas from adults too. They immediately begin to look at the space and see how it relates to CVS or something they're familiar with. Sure. And then I let them pretty much begin to look at the artifacts, and then as you mentioned, Eric, and then engage them and say, oh, so that's how it relates to today and how the people would use it in the past.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I've also done the drugstore, and I'll just ask them what ails them when they come in.
I'm looking forward to eventually talking about the flu epidemic of 1917 and some of the other plagues that have hit us. It's very interesting.
Yeah, Steve, I like your point. You can use humor and be kind of lighthearted to talk about it. So like another example of that is that sometimes if I was interpreting in Stone's store right across the street from the drugstore, people would come in and I'd say, well, did you bring your shopping list with you? You know, just to kind of put them in a certain frame of mind and start off on a informative but kind of lighthearted tone. Other questions? Okay, well, I thank you for your attention and for your patience on doing this on screen as opposed to in person. I will be posting this session to YouTube, and I'll send you all a link to see it,
Great.
so you can review it whenever you like. And if you have follow-up questions from today that kind of bubble up as you muse on what we've talked about this morning, just send me an email, give me a call. I'm happy to talk with you more about it offline. So thank you very much. And I look forward to joining you at the sessions for the rest of the week. And here's to the first step on a journey of lifelong learning. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you,
Eric.
Eric.
Well done.
I
Thanks, Eric.
Bye.
Bye-bye.